Thanks, Martin, for the invitation. Thanks to Anthony and Enrique for having me. It's a huge honor to be here at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. This is an institution that I have admired for many years, and we've used materials from the Lincoln Institute for some of the work we've done in Rio. We've often referenced it, especially around community land trusts, which we see as a real potential model going forward in Rio, and that's what the focus of the talk is today. And this is actually the first time I'm ever talking about the potential of community land trusts in favelas. So I'm going to be sharing some of these ideas for the first time, so feel free to, I'm looking forward to the comments and questions and discussion, and the idea is to kind of prod you and bring up some, questions that we can all work on and think through together. Martin, so I was actually, when I went back to Brazil in 2000, it wasn't my first time there. My mother's Brazilian, and so I do talk a lot. It's in the genes already. But I grew up in Washington, D.C. from the age of 6, and I had always been back to Brazil throughout my childhood regularly, but I hadn't visited favelas. I grew up in D.C. I was involved in social justice and environmental movements. So I guess I might have been sensitized to these issues, but I hadn't worked in favelas until 17 years ago, 2000. I was working on my PhD in city planning at Penn, again, when I met Martin, when he came to visit. And as the Brazilian student, they asked me to spend the day with him, which was an honor. It was not punishment. And so when I went back to Brazil in 2000 as a doctoral student to research in favelas, I went with a certain topic in mind, but actually what happened very quickly was I was inspired by what I was seeing in these communities. I saw how they were planning themselves essentially in the absence of the state, and I wanted to support that process. And so I had the idea to start a nonprofit called Catalytic Communities. And at the time, I got incredible support from my doctoral advisors who encouraged me to do it and to write my dissertation about it. So that's how all this started 17 years ago. So I'm going to give a quick introduction before I get into the context of the why CLTs could work in favelas. And so just in terms of that introduction, first I just want to pan out completely and point out the relevance of what happens in communities like favelas. 1 in 3 people in cities in the world today lives in an informal settlement. By 2050, nearly a third of all humanity will, because cities are where populations are growing and informal settlements are where populations in cities are mostly growing. And they're 85% of housing worldwide is actually built illegally, according to Justin McGurk. And he says this makes residents of informal settlements the primary developers of urban space worldwide, dictating the design and use of more square miles than architects and governments. So the relevance of thinking about these communities isn't just to Rio, even though I'm going to focus in on Rio for this talk. But the ideas that we bring here, we hope that we're beginning the process of a conversation that will support these sorts of communities all over the world. So the status quo today is to dismiss these communities, either ignore them or stigmatize them, or when government does engage with them, evicting residents or pushing them into inhumane public housing. This is the trend, the tendency. And we need a new approach. I mean, if a third of humanity is going to live in these settlements by 2050, we can't just keep doing this, right? And in Rio's case, there are 1,000 informal settlements across the city. They house 24% of the population. They range from tens of people to 200,000 people in the largest favela. But most of them are over 50 years old. They started 120 years ago. How did this happen? Well, in the late 1800s, it all really starts, you can date it back to abolition. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery. Rio was the largest slave port in world history. Rio alone received 2 million enslaved Africans. The U.S. received maybe 400,000 or 500,000. We're talking 5 times the number as the entire U.S. in one city. And so when abolition happened, there were a lot of people still in that area, that region. There were urban slaves, but then also people started migrating in. Brazil urbanized very early relative to other developing countries. Rio was the capital, so that was where the action was. For all these reasons, people came into Rio, and the very first favela in Rio was settled in 1897. They marked their 120th anniversary yesterday, Providência. It was settled because soldiers went to battle in the northeast of Brazil. The government promised their payment in land in the city. When they came back to the city to receive the land, the promise wasn't kept. They squatted on a hill and started the favela. They called it Favela Hill after this spiny plant you see in the top right. That's the favela bush. It was the bush where they lived in the northeast of Brazil while they were serving battle. It was the bush that was plentiful in their environment. And when they came to Rio and settled the hill, they called it Favela Hill. There is no stigma associated with the word favela in itself, the origin of the word. It doesn't translate literally to slum or shantytown. It's simply the name of a plant. Marching pointed out that there are many communities where people now prefer to use the word instead of favela, community. But actually, there's a new shift happening back. Many, especially young favela organizers, are reclaiming the word favela as synonymous with resistance, resilience, and so there is a shift happening back in that sense. So, if they've been around 120 years, how do you define them? If you think about it, slums, we think of slums as these precarious places people are dying to get out of. Squatters, illegal. Shanty towns are, precarious housing. But in 120 years, favelas actually can become quite consolidated. And there's a point where residents no longer want to leave. They want to stay. They want investments in their community. They don't want to go anywhere anymore. The average favela resident in Rio feels this way, and the average favela in Rio is much more developed than most people expect. So how do you define them? Well, this is how we define them. Basically, there's 4 main components. Simply, they're neighborhoods that develop out of an unmet need for housing. There's no outside regulation, and this is key because the huge variety of what happens in favelas, the flexibility in the environment is a result of that lack of regulation. That can result in very positive, very innovative aspects. It can also backfire and can be very counterproductive. They're established by residents, so these aren't outside developers or speculators usually. They're usually almost entirely built by residents. That means every brick, every tile. That means the embedded history in these communities, especially over 120 years, is really to a great extent. And they evolve based on culture, access to jobs, resources. So a favela in the north zone is different from the south zone. If it's near the port area versus in the post-industrial north zone or the touristy south zone, the opportunities. If they were settled in the 60s, that'll be very different to a favela in the 80s when they knew about drug trafficking and prevented it in the community design. So the type of leaders you have has a huge effect. The fact that they're unregulated means that that those different characteristics have even more of an effect because of all the potential ways that a community might unfold. They're incredibly diverse. So basically, to summarize that same list in 4 other words, favelas are affordable housing, they're informal, they're self-built, and they're unique. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this slide, but we've identified that often people talk about formality and informality, and they talk about informality as the absence of formality. And what we've noticed and uncovered essentially working with favelas is that actually there's 2 different logic structures. They're not, one isn't the absence of the other. They're 2 ways of operating. For example, the role of the state is simply not present essentially to a great extent in favelas. There's the role of the market is quite different in the 2. And then things like the logic of privacy versus the logic of proximity, the fixes through formal means versus through hacking. There's an indigenous word in Portuguese called gambiarra, which basically is hacking. It's developing creative responses to situations, the resources that you have available. And these are things that we tend to value when they're done by middle-class white people, right? So the whole sharing economy is based on a lot of these principles. We create new terms, maker spaces, right? But actually in favelas, tactical urbanism. In favelas, all of these things are happening and have been happening for a long time. So we try to value these things, okay? this is from a study from a book called A Country Called Favela, and just some of the data points. When I show articles that are posted like this, it's from our news site called Rio on Watch, and you can find them there. But this particular one, you can see in the 10 years when Brazil was experiencing rapid economic growth, the average wage in favelas grew more than the average wage across society. Favela residents considered themselves happier than the national average. 81% of them liked favelas, 66% wouldn't leave their community, and 62% were proud to live there. So, you know, in different talks I talk a lot about stigma and the narrative around favelas. I'm not going to talk about that today. But you can see that in resident perspectives, and I could show lots of other material about this, that those stigmas don't hold. So just a quick, again, background, part of the background, I just want to point out, go back to basic, psychology, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I like this particular breakdown because it actually separates shelter as a physiological need on the bottom rung, so with air, food, water, right, sleep. And then property is on the next rung. So property is part of security, right? It's also a need, essentially, but it's not at the same basic level. And just pointing out that, so in our research, we found there seems to be this 20% rule, which I brought up last week with the Lincoln folks. And I'm curious what others have to say. And I looked it up for New Zealand. Apparently, New Zealand also meets this rule. There was some skepticism. But what seems to be hold is that at least 20% of the population of a typical city cannot afford market rate housing. So the private sector doesn't naturally meet this need, which makes sense because the private sector isn't going to build for people with very low incomes. They can't afford the structures. And so as a result, around the world, cities figure out solutions. Government through social rent or subsidies or public housing, or inclusionary zoning, or the civil society sector through cooperatives, or in developing countries, informal settlements. So it's not a coincidence that 24% of Rio's population lives in favelas. So as a consequence, in a context where informal settlements are the affordable housing stock, if they're shifted to the formal market, taking on the full land value associated with their location, they, as a consequence, no longer perform the role of affordable housing. That 20% will have to find a new alternative. So this is one of the core questions and concepts we're looking at when we think about why community land trusts are a very productive strategy to think about for favelas. In the context of Rio, this would mean that new favelas, occupations of abandoned buildings, or in some cases moving to public housing, would be the alternative for people once full titles are issued or people have full market value of their houses. And all of these are actually worse than the consolidated favela environments of today. And finally, to preserve the qualities communities have developed over time, including the way of life they value, community control over their own development is key. This is especially true in historically self-built neighborhoods. So these are just some of the intro concepts, ideas that I wanted to share. I'm just going to go a very brief overview of some of the deep-rooted problems around the state involvement in favelas in Rio historically and especially in the last few years. The main policy of the state towards favelas historically has been one of cycles of neglect and repression. So favela residents are left to their own devices, very little investment, and then when things go sour, when there's crime, they come in and repress in this kind of ongoing cycle that we now see with huge increases in crime rates and the consequences of that. The consequence of the history, as you can see on racial maps of the city, a very clear divide racially between favelas and formal wealthy areas of the city. And now, in the last few years, with the Olympic investments, we saw that they were overwhelmingly placed in areas that are already relatively well off. So the north zone of Rio, which is the light pink area on the map on the top left, that's the area with that's planning area 3. It has the largest population concentration of any area in Rio. It's 38% of the city's population. But you can see that they have 12% of the city's leisure areas. So this is just kind of an indicator that we have available of this inequality. But you could look at that same indicator on many other, investments, and you would see the same breakdown. There's also this deep-rooted criminalization of poverty in Brazil. This was just an article from a couple weeks ago in Huffington Post when Madonna posed with police officers in a favela. She got a very bad rap for that. In this piece, the journalist breaks down the very high crime rates and police repression that we see in Rio. Now, the second big problem with the way the state intervenes in favelas is that we've seen a history of evictions. Now, Brazil has very strong laws, in theory, to protect favela residents. Again, the oldest favela just turned 120. 30 years ago, when Brazil passed its new constitution in 1988, because the housing movements at this point had become so strong, because favelas now were already essentially historic neighborhoods. There was a movement, and as a result, we got an adverse possession clause in Brazil's constitution. So as of 1988, people who live informally on urban land, after 5 years, if nobody's convicted you of trespassing, in theory, that land is now, you have the right to be there. If it's private land, you have the right to the full ownership. If it's public land, you have the right to a lease, essentially, or use rights on the land. So this is the law. In practice, very rarely are those titles given, and so people are still left at the mercy of the authorities. Historically, from 1988 to about 2008, for 20 years, we didn't have very many evictions at all in Rio. But after the Olympic decision was announced in 2009, we started seeing this huge wave of evictions again, because the Olympics created a pretext for restructuring the city and not going through traditional participation channels. And so 80,000 people were removed from their homes in the lead up to the Olympic Games. These are maps from 3 different research groups, all showing the same phenomenon. So Rio's south zone, which is the touristy area, is bottom right-hand corner. Eastward corner. The north zone you saw earlier, the west zone is over here. This is a 2-hour distance, east-west. So you can see that people were being removed from the areas of the city that were central and where there's more economic activity to the extreme west zone. And this was a process that we saw throughout those Olympic build-up years. And even now, the Olympics are over, and we have a new mayor, but there have been quite a few eviction threats this year. Most recently, the community of Rio das Pedras, they have come out, they have mobilized by the thousands very quickly, and they stopped the mayor in his tracks. But there's still a lot of pressure on them and other communities. So gentrification is the third threat, and this was a threat that nobody would have thought of, right? Then gentrifying a favela, how could that happen? But in the years leading up to the Olympics, the city invested a lot of resources on marketing. So you can see here the actual spending versus planned spending on marketing. There were incubators for international business, a lot of publicity, a lot of major world events happening in Rio in those years. And so that caused markets to go up. As a consequence, Rio actually went from being I think it was about 23rd most expensive city in the world in 2010 or so, to by 2014 it was the 11th most expensive city in the world. But more concern, it was the city with the highest cost of living increase in the world in those previous 8 years. So Rio's cost of living in 8 years went up by 86%. So you can imagine in a city where this is happening and there are no caps on property values and rent prices and so on. There's no regulation of those markets. So all of the formal areas of the city, there was huge speculative pressure on them. The wealthy areas, people were being displaced even from wealthy neighborhoods. So upper middle class people who lived in Ipanema now moved to Copacabana. Copacabana moved to Flamengo and so on. So there was this kind of process where the city, there's kind of domino effect. And of course you imagine favela residents, especially favelas in the wealthy South Zone, with police coming in and stabilizing those communities, became tourist hotspots, became areas of speculative pressure. And this is just showing that the growth, the real estate market, what happened from 2009 to 2012. And then back down. And now, it's been going down since because of the economic recession. So our news site, Rio on Watch, was the first to publish anything about gentrification in favelas in 2011. We talked about the case of Babilônia. Babilônia and Vidigal are the favelas that have experienced the most gentrification. You can see in the case of Vidigal, even the Financial Times in 2013 published a buying guide. And it had, what you can buy for £100,000, several 3-bedroom concrete houses in Vidigal. £500,000, a 2-bedroom apartment close to Ipanema. In other words, this is a good deal, guys. You should do it, right? So this was really real. Around that same time, we published, we started using this slide in some of our presentations, just kind of showing what we thought would be a recipe for integration. The idea that we introduce here is that you don't want to just bring in any services that are necessary. There needs to be an order and an intention behind the way services are delivered. The government kept insisting that security needed to be number one for them to bring in other services. So we said, okay, let's take that as a baseline. Well, then next, you need to bring in these sets of services: education, healthcare, sanitation. These are high priority for residents. In every public meeting, those are the ones that people most emphasize: education, health, and sanitation. These are public services, basic public services. And then we estimate maybe 5 years down the road, housing don't necessarily need new housing. They need, better materials, credit, technical support. And then later you improve, because these already exist. Water, electricity, and so on already exist for the more than 90% of favela houses. And so these really require formalization more than anything else, and that's fine, but we want to bring in that market-based stuff at the end, so people have essentially been able to develop the ability to pay and partake. So this would be a virtuous cycle of integration, right? We put land titling, and we encouraged collective titling already when we started doing the slide, or sharing the slide. And the goal of this process is to ensure residents take advantage of development, that they build the capacity to pay and partake in the development, and they avoid exploitation. But unfortunately, what we saw at the time was the very opposite was happening. It was a recipe for gentrification. The government was coming in with security. Rents were going up immediately. Then they started forcing people to pay for all sorts of services they already had been using, but maybe weren't paying for or weren't paying fully for, formalizing businesses, and giving outright land titles. And this was essentially a recipe for gentrification. So the government was actively funding the gentrification process. In terms of trust, this is the final element of government, relationships with the government, some of the problems with the relationships with the government. Trust is huge. Especially after these recent Olympic years, when it was the first time in the history of Rio where this kind of money was being invested in the city. Over $20 billion were invested in Rio, and it was hoped that many of these programs would benefit the poor. And to have the result of that process now be that pretty much none of that panned out. Even the huge transportation investments, researchers are now showing commute times have actually increased in Rio, despite all of that. So we haven't seen that, and the trust as a result is completely zero. We're devoid of trust in the authorities in favelas. This is an example where the cable car was built against popular demand. Community wanted sanitation improvements, but they got a cable car instead. But once it was built, they used it, right? And then it was shut down. And now it's being turned into police stations. This is, this Sherry Arnstein's Ladder of Citizen Participation is an incredibly useful resource for understanding the different kinds of what government calls all of these things participation, but actually only these are real participation. If you start manipulation, when the authorities are manipulating you or simply informing you or consulting you, where that doesn't actually turn into anything. All of these are the tendency in Rio, and so over historically. So people just don't trust the authorities. Then the government complains people don't show up for meetings, but the reason they don't show up for meetings is because they don't believe that what they have to say is going to matter. Like in the consultations around the cable car, where for months hundreds of residents would come out, and finally they got something that they didn't ask for. Now this particular meeting in Chapéu Mangueira, it's in Chapéu Mangueira, Babilônia, in the Babilônia favela that I mentioned earlier, was the first that we reported on on gentrification in. This is on YouTube. This woman is, does anybody have a guess of what she's screaming about? I could give you like 100 guesses, and none of you would guess. Because she's screaming about how she does not want title because it's going to bring gentrification. She's screaming about how the electric utility is ramping up their bills, and all these bills are going to force them all out. So the lack of trust is potent, and you can see the result of it. So let's move on to the potential. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm not going to actually go into these slides too much, but in our work over the years, we've grown to really recognize the qualities of favelas, including urbanistic qualities that planners often try to build into cities after the fact, but they're already there in favelas for the most part. Things like affordable housing in central areas. In the particular case of Rio, favelas all developed around work opportunities, and they're really scattered all over the city. They're in all zones and all neighborhoods. So they're already widely accessible in terms of their location. Low-rise, high-density, right? So they're not super high-rise or sprawled, both of which produce more isolation. They're very socially rich environments. A lot of that is from the built environment. It's like a virtuous cycle. They're mixed use, they're pedestrian-centered. Now down here, organic architecture, and this is key for why people like the favela home so much when they're told they have to leave. Because the favela houses, people move in, and it's often very precarious when they start, and they're working on it with their own hands and feet and family and friends. Their baby's born, they add a room. Their child grows up, they add a floor. They become unemployed, they move upstairs and start a shop downstairs. Then they maybe open another floor, rent it out. And then they'll put a rooftop terrace so they have their leisure space. Sometimes when you look from favelas from above, you realize they actually do have a lot of leisure space on the rooftops when we're thinking down on the street level. And then you're also thinking about the streets, and they don't have leisure space, but actually the streets are pedestrian oriented. So then you wonder, why are the kids all out? Aren't they being watched? Well, yeah, actually there are no strangers and no cars, which are the two fears that we have in other communities. So a lot of these things, I'm not, it's not a panacea, it's not a utopia. That's not what I'm arguing. But I think that the lens that we have on these communities is very misguided. Social cultural assets, which you don't even need to get into, right? Because practically everything about popular culture in Rio is either born in or strengthened in favelas. And a couple of years ago, one of the architects that developed the LEED for neighborhood development certification reached out to us. So this is a green communities certification. And he said, I'm interested in how this applies to favelas. And we've been working with him for these years on different things. But we decided, we had an intern apply the certification to a favela called Asa Branca, which is right near the Olympic Village, which was certified as LEED ND. And we did a comparison. And we found out that actually the favela had a higher standing than the LEED certified Olympic Village due to these aspects, right? So neighborhood pattern and design, location and linkages, and others. So the average favela resident wants to see their community improve, rather than seek alternative housing. And we refer to these as consolidated favelas. The consolidated favelas that have been most successful in their development are those that took advantage of the flexibility that comes with informality to self-organize and implement their own, quote, tactical insurgent improvements rather than waiting for the authorities. Here's an example from the top of the forest, the Tijuca forest in Rio, of a community called Valle Encantado, where because they're so out of the way, the government's never showing up. It's a small favela of maybe 40 homes, but they're developing their own biodigester for sewage, for food waste. They have solar panels, they do eco tours, they have the most delicious lunch. You can go and visit them. And they're building a whole local economy around sustainability there. And they were featured in Atlantic, as part of the solution to sewage in Rio. So this is what can come out of taking advantage of the qualities out of the informal process. So now, finally, let's focus on community land trusts and if they can be part of the solution for how we work with informal settlements. A few years ago, when we saw gentrification start to become a problem in Rio, and we started calling it out and introducing the term, because the term didn't exist in Rio, people were starting to call it remoção branca, which means white eviction. They were noticing that as this kind of, this nocive kind of process that was happening, but there wasn't more information about it. So we worked with the Residents Association and a number of community groups in Vidigal, and they organized 4 debates on different aspects of this, introducing the concept of gentrification. In the first one, they didn't call it gentrification, they called it real estate speculation and the increase in prices in Vidigal. That's how they attracted the community's interest at the time. They were very exciting, or I should say very active debates with 200, 250 people at each of them. The second debate was about what future they wanted. So the idea was to document community assets, focus on what the community wants for itself as in this process. Now looking at...
Say that this is one of the highest valued areas.
Yes. Yeah, so Vidigal is probably on the most valuable land in Brazil, I think. It's got the most unbelievable view you can imagine. Now, it's a favela with incredible cultural resources, community organizations. It's about 80 years old. I think they just celebrated their 80th birthday. Actually, right now, as we speak, they're having a literary festival there, a favela literary festival, which circulates different favelas every year.
This is where the Pope left his ring.
That's right, the Pope left his ring there. And that's part of, and they were the first favela, the final favela during the military dictatorship to suffer eviction threats, and they fought it off, partly thanks to the Pope's visit. That was also used by them as in their campaign. But they fought off the eviction, and that's what stopped the eviction cycle during the military regime. So yeah. They're a very important community, and they have historic claims, and that's why people were concerned with gentrification. Now, the Classic Community Land Trust, it's a U.S., this is the U.S. Classic Community Land Trust model. It's applied in Europe as well. Now, we developed a few years ago this flyer, which there's a Portuguese version that just kind of explains what the matter might be with community upgrades and individual titling strategy and how CLTs, in other words, when the government comes in and improves your community and then provides titling, well, that could create, speculation. CLTs are different from this. They build value into the community. For those who aren't familiar with community land trusts, it's basically a model where, here in the US, there's the Dudley Street case here in Boston, it's very well known. Normally what happens essentially is a nonprofit association will buy land and develop housing, and the members of the association, the residents, they own the houses, they buy the houses, but the land is owned collectively by this trust, by this nonprofit. And that takes the land value element out of the equation. And land is often the biggest or one of the biggest costs of the value of housing. We did this comparison with other programs in Brazil and how community land trusts essentially offered solutions for affordable housing, grassroots control, and a number of other things. In this process of looking at community land trusts in the US and Europe, and then looking at, thinking about it in Rio, one of the things that's become clear is we need to just define what the core components are of this model, because we can't it's not like in the US system is not what we're looking at for favelas. In favelas, you already have the housing stock. In favelas, you already have a community built. In favelas, favelas are on public land already. They don't have to buy land if the government transfers it. So there are different constraints. So what would a CLT be? What are the core components? And we've been thinking about these as the core components. One is you have to opt in. Thanks. One is you have to opt in, so this is never forced on anyone. And in the US, that's not an issue. Obviously, people are opting in to a community land trust. But in the context of a favela, we have to be careful around that, because if all of a sudden the government creates, let's say in some case, the government just said, we're going to transition title to this trust, there would have to be a lot of community conversations before that could happen in a healthy way. Collective land, so the basics are the land is collectively owned, the homes are individually owned, the community controls the community land trust, so the land is theirs, but it's just not part of the value of their homes. and they're affordable for perpetuity. These are a couple of very different cases. This one here is in Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico has now created the world's, well, we called it the world's first favela community land trust. Apparently there's also one in Kenya. We're looking into learning more. So it may not be the first favela community land trust, but it's certainly the closest in proximity to what we're trying to do in Rio in terms of the constraints and so on. And what happened in Puerto Rico was this canal, and this is a picture of it again here. This is the canal. So these were favelas that formed decades and decades ago when rural workers came to the city, and they formed informal settlements along the margins of the canal. The canal became an environmental problem, a lot of pollution going into it, residents fighting for improvements. When the government went in to talk to them about, finally in the last, about 15 years ago, about how to improve the water quality, and started talking about titling as well, the community, it became very aware, both the government officials and the community, that when this process happened, this community would be prone to gentrification because it's in the heart of San Juan. This is a very valuable area. And so through public meetings, the community worked together and decided that they actually wanted to do their development through a community land trust model. And they studied the local legislation and adapted the legislation to create their own law in Puerto Rico to make community land trusts viable there.
The interesting thing is that was indirectly inspired by the Lincoln Institute, because the Lincoln Institute was involved in the Dudley Street project. And this is the person that actually took the idea to Puerto Rico was inspired by the Dudley Street.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there is a connection there.
No, and actually it's really a community. The Community Land Trust, it's not just a community within the CLT, it's a global community. Now with what's happened in the case of Puerto Rico, with the hurricane, the whole area has become, 50% of the houses lost roofs, major flooding, but there's been a huge international response for the Caño, for this particular community. I think they've raised over $150,000 to rebuild roofs and so on, because the international community land trust networks are supporting them as well. So there's a lot of potential, right? These are some of the points that we've identified so far. A CLT model would allow us to maintain the qualities of informality while addressing the challenges, for example, by providing the formalizing instrument of a CLT. There's no need to develop a housing stock or community, as is the case in the US, but rather the focus in Rio would be on developing the CLT institution, the procedures, the participation, the infrastructure development itself. It maintains what has become de facto Rio's affordable housing market. Like I said, the risk of full individual titles is we're just going to push the lowest income members of these communities away into worse housing. We're not going to solve the real problem. And we'll lose what have become, in some cases, historic neighborhoods. The fixed costs of living are lower than either in the formal market or public housing. This is something we don't know the details yet, but we want to iron out kind of what are the fixed costs of living in a CLT in Rio versus public housing in Rio versus if you get individual title. But it's clear that they will be lower. Now they can preserve and encode community assets. This allows them to continue self-organizing, but with the backing and collective regulation provided by the CLT. So they don't have to lose their self-control. There's a great deal there's a lot of strength that comes in being able to, when you're low income in a favela environment, and you can't control a lot of what happens around you in the world, you don't have a lot of resources to do that. But your home is something that you can develop and adapt to your needs, and your community is an expression of that. And a lot of that can be done without financial resources. And so being able to maintain that is a boon to people who are developing in a developing context. And finally, it addresses the #1 concern of residents, which is their ability to stay. If you ask the average person in a favela, why do you want your title? They'll say, because I want to stay here. Because I know I don't want anybody to get me out of here. And you get that through the titling of a CLT, but you don't get the potential gentrification effects. So I'm not going to go into this whole slide, but this is just framing. So CLTs fit really well with what's called asset-based, well, it's normally called asset-based community development, ABCD. we've been, over the years, just observing how the government tends to do the deficit-based favela development, right? Focusing on deficiencies, problem response, charity orientation. You know, in asset-based favela development, there's a focus on community assets, identifying opportunities, investing in them, and so on. There's a different framework for how these communities are treated through an asset framework. And so CLTs allow that to be maintained and strengthened. And this is just an example. This is used for asset-based community development, but it fits, I think, also what the CLT model could bring favelas, right? People can get things done without having to go through the formal system. Yep, thanks. So finally, I'm just going to provide a little bit of context from Brazil's current legislative context. So in the early 2000s, there was the city statute passed in Brazil, and it includes a provision, sorry, this is in Portuguese, but for what are called zones of special social interest. And this is national legislation codifying the fact that there are certain areas, and this is mainly used for favelas, that should be maintained for affordability and developed and upgraded, recognizing that. So there's already legislation in Brazil that recognizes that these communities should be, in many cases, protected to some extent. This is very different from eviction, and it's also very different from gentrification. It's trying to prevent both. So there's already legal precedent for trying to prevent both of those extremes. Now, we're currently in Brazil, we're in a time of economic collapse. And in that context, we have a new president, well, an interim president who is not elected, who I should say has less than 1% approval rating, who I don't think anybody in the country feels, or almost anybody feels, is representative. But he has managed to get through a major change to, these are just different articles we published on the same law, which finally passed. This is from when it started as an executive order. There's a lot of debate about it, and it finally passed. And this is a new federal law that went through insane amounts of revisions, so it's not popular. You know, hundreds of revisions before it was finally approved. But basically, it tries to deal with the fact that, oh, sorry, that's later. It tries to deal with the fact that 50 to 70% of Brazil's land is actually irregular. So recent studies have shown this, and the federal government just decided we're going to do something about this, and we're just going to take all federal lands and we're going to privatize it, essentially. And so the landowners will get title. And so this opens the floodgates for favelas on federal lands to all get titles. And which, again, initially when you think, oh, good, they're going to be titled, it'll bring security. But with the context that I've provided, you can see how that could be a big concern. And it has been for lawyers and civil society groups in Rio who work with favelas and believe this is really about speculation and not about actually bringing rights to these residents. But, you know, so then the ZACE, right? So we have these two laws at the federal level. We have this law, the Zones of Special Social Interest, which says that favelas should be recognized and integrated, essentially, in an affordable way. And then we have this new law that says we need to give out titles to everybody. And so could these, in the context of the economic recession, be actually a boost to the idea of bringing CLTs to favelas? There are two opportunities potentially in the current climate that we're looking into. One would be to propose a community land trust law. Again, you know, there's a current opening and the desire by the federal government to regularize all public lands. 50 to 70% are irregular, right? And again, we've talked about this. If they're regularized according to current plans with full land titles, favelas in Rio will quickly gentrify with land values in many of those areas driving prices through the roof. Proposing a CLT law that balances this desire with the zones of special interest and community desire for security over speculation may be a solution. Again, the opting in would be important if we do this through a legal framework. Communities can't, this shouldn't be imposed. You're not going to get a productive community environment if people feel forced to be there. Or the other option we've thought about is you could have an opt-out period where people could sell their homes for market value to the trust. Anyway, that's getting more technical. And then the second idea is to develop a community pilot. If there were one particular favela that was going to get their individual titles and they wanted to create a community land trust with their titles when they acquired them, then that would actually also be a vehicle. And if one favela did that and it worked, then there would probably be a domino effect or an effect of other community, a ripple effect of other communities joining. So my traditional closing remarks when I give a talk are the following. You know, I ask, what would Rio be like if it embraced its unique history of each of its favelas and recognized their contribution to the city, you know, and supported their future development in ways that honored resident knowledge and history? What would they be like with investment, justice, and creativity? This is an image from Valparaíso, where I was told started as favelas and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And what if Rio set an example for the world? Again, a third of humanity is predicted to be in informal settlements by 2050. What if we could create a new model of community-led integration rooted in community assets and benefiting from the qualities of informality? And so I ask, could CLTs be part of that answer? And I think they could. And so I wanted to bring that conversation to you today and hope to get lots of feedback and hear what you think about this idea. So thanks. And also, the talk is available here if you want to see it. Okay.
Well, that was quite something. Thank you.
Thanks.
Can you? I'm going to open the floor for discussion, but before we do that, I just wanted to provoke you. A favela it gives you a sense of a certain glorification of favelas, but there is a lot of it's not an easy way for many of them, and we know we have a lot of information about inside exploitation also. The enormous increase in rentals in favela. This means that people coming in are being exploited on rental contracts that are much harder than even in the asphalt, in the sense that the ratio of what you pay for rent, the value of the house is much higher. So can you give us a sense of the downside of being in a favela? So because is that the model for affordable housing? Because if this is the model, then what you would see is an enormous stimulus to that to flourish and continue to grow. Yeah. Is that really what we're looking for?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you. So I think it's not that it's a model. I think that favelas are not. When a favela starts, you can say there's a public policy failure because affordable housing wasn't guaranteed and people don't have other options. But once it becomes consolidated and residents say, I'd rather be here and I want to see my community improve and I see value in this place and it's important to me, then the policy failure is to ignore that and pretend that that's not the case and kind of preamble on those rights. And so I think it's important, that's when I say consolidated favelas for lack of another term, but that's what we refer to, favelas where that has been achieved. And I think there's nothing, they're very complex environments, because of the lack of regulation, they're very diverse because of the history, all the things I mentioned. And so you get incredibly different outcomes. It's so problematic the way they're lumped because they are so incredibly unique. And even within one favela, you'll go to 2 different streets and have very different experiences. You'll go to the same favela 2 weeks apart and have a completely different experience. They are incredibly dynamic, like unbelievably dynamic. And I think that is the work, what I like about something like the CLT or other models where we get down to basics and let communities find ways for communities to control that process in a healthy and productive way where they can channel the qualities of the informality and the qualities of what they've done already, I think is important because it allows you to focus community by community. Each one is going to have to be treated individually or we lose. It's like diversity and lots of things we appreciate, biodiversity, linguistic diversity. These communities have produced incredible diversity that I think is valuable, and we lose something when we lose these communities. The ones that, and again, there are favelas where you'll go and people will say, I want out of here. Please sign me up for public housing. And then there's favelas where you say, please, I want out of here, but sign me up for public housing nearby, or else I'll just stay here, even though it's really precarious. because I need to be here. So there's lots of situations and they need to be handled individually. But I think that if you ask people, you have the answer. You don't need to do huge, it's not that complicated. You just talk to people. So,
Good.
thanks.
Questions? Elizabeth.
My question is, what would be the relationship of a CLT with the state or city in this case? I mean, it has to be legal. This statute would have to be legally created and so forth. But as you pointed out, if the state isn't absent, its presence in terms of urban services, health education, et cetera, public safety is pretty disastrous. So would the relationship with the state, with CLT, according to this model, change at all?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ideas that we can float around as we discuss, because this is the beginning of a long process, right? Is so there's some things the state has to provide. It has to be the one providing, like education and healthcare. There are other things where the community could build their own infrastructure, coordinate the building, not necessarily physically build it. I mean, be responsible for the much more effectively than the government if they had the resources available, because the government has the resources and doesn't spend them, right? Improving roads, or they widen roads and evict people when they don't need to, or they don't consult people about their real preferences for transportation and then do the wrong thing. A community land trust, if they had those same resources, could actually do real development, which is what's happening in Puerto Rico's case, for example. So I think figuring out what are the services the government's still going to provide directly, and what are the services that the community would be more efficient and effective in providing, and that the government, I think, if it's these are public services, the government should pass those resources on to the CLT, and the CLT would be responsible for implementing them. That would be ideal. But who knows? I mean, the reality is, right now the government rarely does those things. So it's not like we're not going to get that, or we are. We don't really get it now, except during moments of political, brief periods where we get political action in favelas.
Pre-election.
Yeah.
Election day.
Or in the 90s with the Favela Biden program, for example. We had one period where we had more of that.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Ali Khan Mohammed. I'm an urban planner at Sasaki, and I'm working on I'm working on a couple of projects where we're looking at informality from a citywide scale, and I think my first question was exactly that. Is there a relationship between the CLT and the state in terms of sort of community infrastructure? But then when you jump up a level, a big part of the problems with favelas and informality is that they're not connected to larger citywide networks, and there's some types of infrastructure, whether they're sewage mains or highways or roads, that kind of need to be thought of at a higher level. And so I'm curious if you've either seen instances where that's been coordinated well, where if it's a CLT or another type of upgrading, it's been coordinated well at the community level as well as the citywide infrastructure level. And if not, do you have any ideas or suggestions or things you'd like to see?
Okay, thanks. I'm just trying to think of where one individual favela would be integrated into a much larger system. Well, in the case of sewage, what often happens in smaller favelas will self-develop their own sewage if they have it at all. It'll be their own system, and then it'll just go into a creek or something nearby. And then the authorities will come in when they do, if they do, and put that system into the formal system if it's good enough, or else rebuild parts of it if necessary, and integrate it into the formal network. So I think it is possible already in cases like that where this community can integrate into the existing system. But if they had more resources, and it was, I think, done in partnership. So the typical way CLTs are structured, the board of directors is divided in thirds, and it's voted in by the community, but it's a third residents from the community, leaders or residents, and then a third is neighbors or people around the CLT, which is the one thing where there might be an issue in Rio making that work, although I can see where it might work actually. But then the third is technical folks, lawyers, architects, engineers, urban planners. And so I think that's where that expertise comes in, I would imagine, is to make sure that, when these would be local institutions, essentially, that would be doing development like they are in other places where CLTs happen. And yeah, I think it would be interesting if it had a relationship. In the case of Puerto Rico, my understanding is the government has an agency that's set up to facilitate the creation of the CLT for a period of, I think, about 10 years. I don't think it's exactly 10 years, but there are people here who I think Enrique might know, right? But there's for 10 years or so. And then after that, the case, they dissolve. The government entity dissolves and the community is completely responsible. So I mean, this obviously has to be done in partnership, essentially, in that sense. Although, it could be done on its own as well. I think both are possible. And maybe a larger favela would need more government as well.
Adriano?
Teresa, congrats for your presentation.
Please,
Yeah, my name is Adriano. I'm from Brazil. I am a PhD student and one of the Lincoln's Fellow for the Trans-American program. And I have a basic question. Maybe I don't know much about community land trust, but what in fact does it mean not having the land property? Because housing is a specific good because you cannot transfer the housing for another place and just send the housing without the surface. And in Brazil we have a specific thing that we don't own the underground of the land, right? It's owned by the
Surface,
government. So
yeah.
we only have the right to use the surface. So how do you think that this very specific aspect is related to community land trust? And I know that you can sell your house if you are in a community land trust, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you can sell your house, but you cannot transfer it for another place, what exactly does it mean not having the property of the land,
Mm-hmm.
In the end, how can you, in fact, speed up the house and the land? How does it affect the land prices in the end? Well, it's a gentrification, so
Yeah.
we are talking about the land prices.
So I'm learning about CLTs as I go, but my understanding is normally there's a price that's attached to that. So there's a fixed price of increase in the value of the house that's pre-established when the CLT is created, and the house, when you're ready to sell, you want to sell, you sell it, but you sell it to the CLT. There's some cases where you can sell direct. So I'm giving you a model. Like I said, there's these core characteristics that I listed. So this doesn't have to be this way. There are places where you could sell directly to someone else, but you still have to keep it at an affordable level. But what happens in the US is you sell to the CLT. The CLT buys it at the rate that's been agreed. When you bought into the system, you agreed to this. So you bought the house within the in the US, within the affordable rate, and then you sell it at an increase, but not a market increase. You sell it back to the CLT, and then the CLT then has, in the US, usually a waiting list of people who have qualified because they need affordable housing, and the next family or whatever is due, they get to buy the house at this affordable rate. And that's how it's kept for perpetuity affordable in the US system. But yeah, this is an issue that comes up when we're thinking about it in the context of favelas, is, people would have to choose to opt out of getting the full property value.
Yeah.
But this is where, what are people's real motivations when they live there and want title? Because most people talk about their desire to stay in their communities. And so that is not really met if this becomes a speculative environment. They're not going to be able to afford it, whether it's their property tax, whether it's their electricity bills and so on that are going to be fully rated, whether it's the neighboring businesses that are going to change and they're not going to be able to afford them, whether it's people walking by their front door that was always open and now they can't, don't feel comfortable anymore because they used to feel like they knew everybody. And And, you know, all of those things, or the architecture starts changing, or big buildings start going up, or whatever. So it's kind of a trend that it's almost inevitable, and we saw it because we've seen it in Rio, what it looks like already in favelas because of the pre-Olympic buildup, and where areas this did happen, and people lived it, and people left. Who couldn't afford to stay, or sold their house thinking it was a lot of money, and then realized afterwards it was not a lot of money and ended up much worse off. Now there's other people who sell, and they say, yay, I can go retire in my native northeastern, you know, where I grew up, in the northeast of Brazil. So there are cases where people will want to sell. That's why I think opting in is essential. I don't think a policy like this could be forced on anybody. But I think through information and giving people clear information about the cost of living they're going to experience, the benefits of a CLT where you get to self-organize, you get to maintain your control over how you build and what you do, you get to be an active member in the decision-making of your community and how it's going to unfold. All of these things, I think, for people who do intend to stay in that community are a huge plus. And if this happened generally, you would have this entire affordable housing market. And if, let's say, you get a job in another part of the city, well, you could go live in a favela over there where it's now, they have their CLT, and you would buy out, you sell in your CLT and move into a different CLT. And so, you know, you would actually create a market for these communities that's formal, as opposed to the one that currently exists and is informal.
It is a big issue that in many favelas, there are people with relatively high income living there already. This is not a place for the very low income. It's no longer, particularly the well-located favelas, because there is a premium on location. There are favelas in the south zone of Rio where the rent on the per square meter is higher than in the asphalt, considering all the circumstances there. So this is a place where there is some gatekeeping also. People who are in, they remain because some of them are making some money on that, and particularly on the enormous increase in the rental market there, because it's not many of them that there are even some agreements because they are located in environmentally protected areas where the agreement with the city, and this hasn't worked that well, but anyway, where there was some agreement where we would improve, provide some, as long as the association, the community, do not expand, do not invade further invade the protected environmental area. So these kind of things. And this is becoming a big issue there. Some of these favelas in the South Zone, they are really islands of pretty good condition. But there is a big issue there of this may be a high maintenance type proposal of respecting each favela as such and dealing with each favela individually in its singularities. For a local administration to handle that, it's not easy. I mean, you're talking about 1,000 favelas, or see, even if it's only 50 of them, where you have to deal with in each of them with a sort of a special case. This is a very high cost procedure, and as we all know also that to upgrade many of these favelas, the cost of upgrading for the square meter is 2 or 3 times of the cost of building a new urbanized area. So that's for instance, the typical upgrading cost of these programs, and the IDB had this favela buy has been responsible. This was a darling of the upgrading programs in Latin America. They were spending something like $4,000 to $6,000 per family, just to provide basic service, very basic service, and these are high costs. You don't have the option of not doing that. But if this is your policy, then you're in the trap, because there is no. This is a very high cost alternative for people to get and to afford a place in the city.
But I actually think that's a good argument for the CLT because
Yeah, it is. It is
because
actually
then the government's not taking responsibility because the singularity is there. You can't avoid it. You can't treat two favelas alike. It's just the government tries to do it and they get very different responses. And and so to have something where you officially allow them to control the process and support that is probably more efficient, I would think.
Yeah, it would be if you could do this handling directly to some entity at the favela and that would have their own program of how to actually manage the investments there, but also how to recover some of the costs that they have. Otherwise, this has become. I mean, we know that in some research on the dates of arrivals of people in favelas that shows that basically when you do a major program of improvement, after that you got a spike again of incoming people, and that becomes it's an issue that we haven't got the solution yet. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, George Clark. I'm a geographer and librarian at Harvard. Exciting ideas. I'm brainstorming here about some of the implications, and one of them is if, say, we think 30 years out when you want your children and their children to be able to live in the same community. What might happen in private title is some of the land gets sold and we build 10-story buildings so more people can live there, right? So is there any sort of allowance for building up eventually, and how would that work in the land trust model?
Interesting. Well, in the case of favelas, because generally they're all zoned. When they become zoned, they're zoned for 3-4 stories max. So the government wouldn't even allow them to become buildings under most current, the standard treatment. Especially many of them are on hillsides and so on as well, or in flood-prone areas. So for various reasons, they tend to be the kind of low-rise, high-density works. But then you do bring up a great point, which is how can the kids stay? This was one of the big issues that came out in the gentrification years of the pre-Olympic years, was that young people coming of age in the favela were the first generation in 3 or 4 that couldn't live in their community. They couldn't afford it. So either they'd stay in their parents' house or tight with their new family, or they'd leave. Most of them left. And so we heard that a lot. And so with the community land trust model, because affordability is maintained, you have an increasing likelihood that that person would be able to afford housing in their community when they grow up. So when houses did come available, they would be able to. Now, it's a good question whether the favela residents would be able to self-regulate and decide how many floors. I assume that would have to come from the government in terms of whatever their geo-risk evaluations they do about safety. But maybe there would be some pressure for a CLT would be able to pressure to allow 1 more story when it's safe and to try to create those opportunities. But I think CLT model would allow that advocacy to happen in a way that if you just had, those people wouldn't be living there anymore, many of them otherwise.
There was a interesting case of a building. There was a building in the Rocinha, one of the biggest favelas. It built a building from scratch of 11 floors, and some people were writing to the newspaper, "I'm paying taxes and I have to pay, and you're giving this this is illegal what you're allowing them to do." And the mayor responds, "It's illegal, so what?" And this became a site of global knowledge. It's illegal where they dump everything that is illegal and the public tolerates because they don't have any other options to do. So it becomes, it's illegal, so what, right? This became a sort of but it is an issue of in most of these favelas you don't collect property taxes, for instance. And not even after the improvements, right? That this is and the CLTs may be one also avenue to sort of a fully integrate people as fiscal citizens as well, right? Not only. There are 2 questions, 1, 2, and 3.
Hi, Teresa. My name is Fernando, and I recently graduated from MIT City Planning Program. and I think I met you briefly in Rio last year.
Okay.
During one of your many talks. My question was what you thought about the actual organization that would, take on the trust idea in Rio. If you think that there are already nonprofits or other kinds of organizations in the city that could take on this, has the capacity to take on this new role, or if it would start from scratch, would it be CATCOM? Would it, what kind of resources would an organization need to actually start this?
Yeah. Great question. That's something we haven't thought about at all. There are housing movement organizations. They're national, local. There are, networks of technical people who work with favelas in technical support as activists and advocates. There are community associations in every favela that are already legal structures that have the legal right to, that they're legally required actually to keep tabs on who lives where and keep the basic documentation on houses. So we have a lot of the ingredients for creating those structures, but I don't know how it will unfold. That's something where I think we have to have the conversations going forward. So this is something that, so CATCOM, Catalytic Communities, our organization, has been thinking about community land trusts as part of the solution for 5 or 6 years, really seriously, but we were so involved with the Olympic buildup and the human rights issues that we weren't really doing much about it, except for in 2014 when we supported the Vidigal debates series. And now that the Olympics are over and we're focusing on more proactive, more productive kind of urban support for favela residents and policies and advocacy and things like that, this is coming back and we've progressed a lot thinking about it and coming up with the right partners. There's a new group at the Federal University of Rio called LEDUBI that is a group of lawyers looking at housing. And we're working with them already on thinking about what the law might look like. And so our idea is to take that, to basically flesh out that idea and then bring it to workshops, workshop it with community organizers and some of these advocates that I've talked about and social movements and housing movement groups, and basically come all together and just talk about this. What would this look like? How would it work? Would it work? What do we need to do? Does everybody think it's a good idea? What's not a good idea? How would it need to be implemented? And so just work through all of that together with everybody who cares about this. And that's kind of where we see the next step. So figuring out what might need and then bring it to these workshops. And then from there, we also see another major step is just getting this information in a really easy, digestible, useful form so communities can become aware of this instrument and understand it. So if they want to advocate for it or fight for it or work towards it, they can. So it's really it's all about community control and opting in. None of this should be forced on anybody. Oh, and I wanted to mention that the case in Puerto Rico, it's not the entire favelas. It's people, it's families within these 8 communities. And so it's, I think, 2,000, or don't quote me on the number. I think it's 2,000 families within these communities that opted into the land trust model and are working together as a land trust. So you don't even have to be, it doesn't even have to be contiguous. You could have parts of a favela where people have opted in. So that's the other question mark. Like, how well would that work? Maybe it would work really well, actually, because, I don't know. Anyway, yeah. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Sarah Hines. I wrote a book on camp meeting grounds, and I quickly got sucked into the whole issue of land trusts. And this is an American model that dates back over 200 years. And it does keep the cost of housing low. In fact, I'm enacted by Camp Meeting Ground Cottage on the North Shore here of Boston. Seasonal for $7,000, year-round for $80,000. That's in Hamilton, Massachusetts. The restriction on that is you have to meet their standards. You have to be that's religious base. But there are others that are not religious based. There's one in Connecticut, 5 miles from West Hartford. I could buy a cottage for $28,000. Beautiful place, because it's in a land trust. When these historic land trusts are platted and sold off, the prices go way up. So you can go up to Maine, to Bayside, and you can pay $250,000 for a seasonal cottage because it's been platted and titled. So you're absolutely right about that. But look at Ocean Grove, which is just south of Asbury Park in New Jersey, which is 1 square mile of land trust within Neptune, New Jersey. There were a number of these religious land trust set up in the 17th and the 18th century and 19th century. And then the New Jersey Supreme Court said, no religious municipalities here, so it all changed. And so now there's a symbiotic relationship between Neptune, New Jersey, and Ocean Grove, New Jersey, in such that Ocean Grove supplies the fire department. There's a downtown in that, but other than that, who owns the top of the curve versus the bottom of the curve? And the houses are owned by the people with these 100-year or 99-year leases. Sometimes they're paying, you know, $25 a year for it. So it's really interesting. But the other tie into that is the trailer park, which is naturally occurring affordable housing, which we usually have a bad image of that here, but it's essentially, it's a land trust. You own the trailer, you pay rent. And some of those are now resident-owned communities, they call them. So they're much more acceptable out in the Southwest than they are here. But there's none of that restriction. If you ever look at the application form for affordable housing in this state's 21 pages, the 80%, which is the 40B thing, you can't earn over $54,000, and you must earn at least $50,000 to be able to qualify if you're a single person. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's this tiny sliver of people who are addressed by our regulated by income affordable housing. So I think that land trusts have a particular application in this country. I mean, the demand for tiny houses, which are essentially illegal dwellings, they need to be able to plug into something. So there's such a potential here. And I like the stuff that you were talking about for Brazil. I think it's a much richer thing that they're tied into being near where the work is. And that's not the case here because a lot of our land is already pre-bought up. So interesting. I don't know what I have to ask as a question, but I thought there really is application here to bring it into a much bigger focus here. I think the CLT movement here, where they restrict income, is maybe not the way we should limit ourselves. Okay, that's all. Interesting.
Just a quick response. In the Brazilian case, legally, the only way to restrict this is to say it's for people of low income. Anything else would be considered discrimination. So it couldn't be on religious grounds. It couldn't be because your parents live there. It couldn't be anything else. So legally speaking, in Brazil, it's going to have to be income-based. The other thing is the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy did research years ago that we've cited a bit that shows that CLTs are the most robust kind of affordable housing for both extremes. So cases of economic increases and speculation, and when you might get gentrification, and also cases where the economy turns sour and you get a lot of foreclosures. And so I think in the Rio context, I think of evictions and gentrification. It protects from both of those sorts of extremes as well.
So, Enrique Stella from she's first. Oh, I'm sorry.
You can go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Hi. Okay.
Mariah was our intern. She's one of our star interns.
So I interned with Teresa Al last year, and now I'm currently at the GSD studying urban planning. So I'm curious to know if there are already some informal systems of community land trust happening in favelas in Rio where it's owned by, I don't know, it could be like a gang or a group where they're kind of already regulating land and who owns it to some extent, and how that could be incorporated into that. I'm just not sure if there are already kind of these informal systems happening. And then I'm just curious if you could provide a little bit more of an explanation on how people won't be incentivized to, rent out their units in their house, because I know during the lead up to the Olympics, people were able to rent out their house for obscene prices in Vidigal for tourists, international people, Europeans who wanted to get that favela experience. So how would that be regulated, and would that be an issue, in terms of staying true to the community land trust model?
Great questions. Okay, the first one I'm just thinking about. I can't think of anything where it's regulated like they own the land and they are saying, but I think the militias in the west zone of Rio, and I wouldn't want to incorporate them into this, but these vigilante off-duty police gangs, mafias, that have taken over huge swaths of Rio's west zone. They're now real estate developers, and they put up these buildings in favelas, a lot of the big buildings that are going up in the West Zone favelas are militias, and this is one of the few cases where favelas are not being self-built. They are speculative, and it could be that they are putting in people that they favor, that kind of thing. So, but I don't think that qualifies. But anyway, it's a good question, and I'll think about it. There might be some positive cases where that we've seen that. I know that years ago, Vale Encantado, which is the favela in the forest that I showed that's building their sewage system and so on, out of using biodigester technology, they talked about doing a cooperative housing eventually, but I think they put that aside, and now they're just fighting for titles, which I think they're about to get. So there are cases where I've heard of it, but. And your second question, just remind me.
Like for renting, renting out if you.
Oh, the rentals. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, my gut feeling is you have to create the protocol that allows people to benefit from, not renting, not moving out and renting it to speculate, for a high fee, but that allows people to host something like Airbnb, like what happened. But then the question, I feel like you can't deny that. But anyway, I feel that CLT would have to decide that. It's not up to me or you or anybody. I think each CLT would have to decide what they're going to allow of that kind of activity, what they think is favorable for their community. It's really about, okay, we want to conserve certain things about our community. We want to create new opportunities in our community. Where's the balance and how does that fit in? And then they would have to, maybe they'd regulate the values of that and say you can have a cap. I don't know. But that's an interesting question. I think the problem there is the rental market within the favela. That would probably go with either way, with individual titles or CLTs. I feel like, just so you know, averages 25 to 30% of favela homes are rented out by the people normally who live in the favela, but the 70+% are owned.
Growing.
Yeah. And there's more of these kitchenettes, which are tiny little apartments, one room, one person units popping up in favelas as well. People to subdivide to rent to more people, to workers.
Yeah, there's a, sorry, I forgot her name, but Juana Manrique Silva from the Lincoln Institute. There was the question that came out of the history of, from the 200 years in the U.S. One of the beautiful things of your story too is how it's connected to the El Caño, and that this is really in part a story about policy mobility or the kind of transfer of knowledge from one place to another. In Puerto Rico, one of the beautiful parts of the story was here comes this concept from Boston or the US, CLTs, but we're going to make it our own. Part of your project and the relationship with us at Puerto Rico is what from Puerto Rico can be used to kind of help you or help the favelas talk about CLTs. And there's likely going to be a transformation of the CLT there. So the question, and it's kind of a wrap-up question, the CLT's morphing as it travels south. With your knowledge of the favelas, with what's going on in the conversations, and with your engagements with people in El Caño, how do you see the favelas changing the concept of a CLT? So 5-10 years from now, we might not be it might not be CLTs that we're talking about anymore if there is this kind of more. You kind of touched on this, but what about the favelas, the fact that it's landing in Rio, in favelas, with the deep history that you beautifully set up there, might or might not change the concept of the CLT?
I'm sure it will. I don't know. I can't imagine exactly how, right? But I'm sure it will change. I mean, if we are able to do this, and again, I agree with you. It's not a CLT necessarily. It could be something else. But these principles that need to be considered in thinking about how to integrate and support these communities. The idea that governments aren't able to deal with a lot of these communities unless they bulldoze them and just put them all in high rises, and that's not productive. And you see what's happened in Mexico and in other parts of the world where that's not working out. And so I think having this could be a model where you actually solve a lot of those, you check a lot of those boxes, and because it's a worldwide issue. I don't use the word problem because, again, I think favelas at their core are solutions to housing and in the lack of other opportunities. So, but in responding to the issues that come up, we could be solving something much greater.
And you have to, I think just adding to, adding to this argument, many of these, the origins of many favelas have been public lands that have been tolerated to be occupied before elections. People were give land to tolerate people occupying that public land for votes. And the biggest case of that is in Brasilia, where it's almost 80,000 plots of land was given away by the governor, who is in jail now. But this is one of the biggest regularization programs. And so there is this issue of public lands that are giving the so-called concessão de direito real de uso, this concession of the real right of use, because you cannot transfer, you cannot give away public property to individual.
Well, now you can.
Now, because of that.
Because of the new law.
Yeah, but that is a law that has been, the other side of that law has to do with the Amazon.
Yes.
Of the occupation of the Amazon. That's why the 70% of that. This is to actually give away most of these huge occupations in the Amazon of public lands. And I mean, this is outrageous what they're doing with that. This is a scandal.
That's a good question. How much of the 50 to 70% of irregular land in Brazil is actually the Amazon?
Yeah,
right?
So there is this big issue of how the public manage land. And so from Teresa's argument that the community, most of these communities are pretty well organized and they can gatekeep there, right? And in many of these communities, if you want to transact a house, you have to ask permission for the association before you do that. And they would actually collect the tax from your transfer of your property even. So they control who's come in and who leaves. And so this is a big case for the community to take over the control of the community itself, right? So it's an interesting case. It's worth an experience. And the Institute will be very interested in following up on that conversation. And
It is.
yeah, time is up.
Time's up.
Yeah.
Thanks
Yeah,
everybody
it is.
for coming.
So thank you very much, Teresa, for a very nice, very interesting, very enlightening